My name's Michael Goldberg, for those who we haven't met. And I'm the executive director of our Veale Institute for Entrepreneurship here at Case Western Reserve. I also have the pleasure of teaching entrepreneurship at Weatherhead. I have a couple former students on this call, including our moderator, which is great. And Art, it's great to sort of welcome you back to campus in our new world order of Zoom. Art's an alum of Weatherhead and a leader in the business community and the philanthropic community, and is the chair of the board of, I can look outside my window here at ThinkBox, I can see our friends at university hospitals, and we so appreciate everything you do and have done for the university and our community and our hospital system, and it's great to have you join today. Art and I recently reconnected, and we were talking about some of the things that we were doing on campus, and asked him if he would join our speaker series today, so it's great to have you here. All of our speaker series sessions are moderated by students or recent grads in this case, and we're thrilled that Parv Sood, who just graduated from the university in May, and all of our 2020 grads with their, we didn't get to celebrate together in person, but we're so proud of Parv and others that graduated. So Parv is joined Swagelok full time. So, and I know there's a couple of folks that he currently works with that are on the call today. So I will turn it over to Parv. For those that are watching on Facebook, I think we're actually on LinkedIn Live today. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask Art, just put it in the comment and we'll be monitoring and make sure Parv takes a look. And if you're on Zoom, use our chat function and you can put a question for Art in there and Parv will integrate it in. We usually like to call on you directly to ask the questions. Or you can sort of raise your hand. So with that, let me turn it over to Parv, who's going to run the show today.
Thank you, Michael. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Parv Sood, and I currently work for Swagelok, as Michael said, as an engineering associate. I graduated from the Case School of Engineering this past spring, and I studied chemical engineering and business management. Like Michael said, the event is meant to be a conversation. It's very loosely and relaxedly structured. So if at any point you have a question, feel free to raise your hand using Zoom or just shoot it in the chat and I can read it out too. All right, so today's speaker is an alumni of the Weatherhead School of Management's MBA program. He is the former president and CEO of Swagelok. Prior to his role as the CEO, he was the CFO and the COO. He was also a partner at Ernst & Young. As he continued on his career journey, he began to serve on the board of numerous corporations and is presently an independent director at Sherwin-Williams. Please welcome Arthur Anton. Art, would you like to say any opening remarks before we get into it?
Yeah, well, thanks, and it's nice to see so many old friends. And it's kind of, you're on. Everybody's on 1,000 Zoom calls a week, but when you have to host one, it's. It remind me of what my father used to say. I had a face for radio. So anyway, it's hopefully we'll make this interactive. And I haven't done one of these since I left Swagelok, but I always find them personally better when we have a dialogue and can answer questions versus reading a script. So thanks for joining, and it's great to reconnect with CWRU.
All right, awesome. Well, the first question that I have for you today is sort of a broad question. It looks at your early career. So starting out, fresh out of college, we know you studied economics and accounting, and so after doing that, did you sort of make your decisions in the moment in the sense of saying, all right, this is what I studied, this is what I'm going to get into? Or did you sort of go with the flow in terms of how your career progressed?
Yeah, so good question. Just a couple of things. In high school, I was pretty good in the maths and the sciences. So at one time I thought maybe I'd go into the medical field, and my mother was proud of a peacock at that. And then I said, well, kind of like business. Maybe I'll be a lawyer. And she was pretty good with that. When I told her I was going to go into accountancy, I think she was hoping I could find a life of crime or something that would supplement it. So growing up, I guess lower middle class or maybe upper lower class, I really had to concentrate on getting a job, and accountancy, public accounting is a nice entree into a career and a place to get employment. And I had a little bit of an affinity for it, so that's kind of how it all started, if you will. But the good thing is you get to see so many companies and so many industries and so many successes and so many failures. So it really gives you a broad base of operations, and seeing different things. So, I wouldn't say that I had my life planned out. Like many people, I was pretty ambitious, and I always tell people, the one advice I give, if I can, when I would do these intern programs at Swagelok, I would always tell people, bet on yourself, because if you're not going to bet on yourself, who else is? So I kind of, was always, took chances and always tried to learn new things. But no, I wouldn't say I had it all mapped out. I think a lot of it involved in front of me.
Awesome, thank you. The next question I would sort of lead into your later career, just so we get a little bit of an overview, so the panelists can sort of start thinking for different questions that they might have. The second question was, you spent a lot of your time in a position of leadership, whether it's management of various things, various people. How would you describe your leadership style?
I would say, first of all, I think, any good leader, it evolves, right? It not only evolves, it has to become more situational. But I would hopefully, I would describe it as collaborative. I would also describe it as inquisitive. I always like to learn things. Some people on the call will know that I can ask a lot of questions. But I like a lot of different opinions. I like to surround myself with people from different backgrounds, not only, from diversity for diversity's sake, but diversity of thought. Get people involved that have different perspectives on things, and not to take a long time to make a decision, but to really get different perspectives on things. So I would say it would be decisive yet collaborative would be a key, and then very big on learning. Very big on learning. I think at Swagelok, and I'm sure it's still that way with all my friends on the phone here. It's very important about how you do things, not just what you do. So. We really adopted the emotional intelligence framework at Swagelok. Worked with Case on it back in the day with Richard Boyatzis, and put that as part of our performance review system. So it was not only what you did, but how you did it. So really an emphasis on growing and development and leadership was also a big piece of what it stood for. And then, I really stress being a lifelong learner, just kind of trying to learn new things, new skills, etc.
Thank you. So you just said that you like to stress being a lifelong learner. Is that something that you have decided to focus on for 2020 since COVID has started, or anything recently that you feel like you spend a lot of your time learning with?
I just constantly try to learn and read. Chairing UH, there's a whole new set. University Hospitals, a whole new set of challenges. Of course, COVID. I've read more on pandemics and viruses than I ever thought I would ever read. Thank God we've got the internet, so you can look up some of these terms and try to scratch your head and remember some cell biology that you forgot a long time ago. But I just think it's important in any role you have to keep evolving and stuff like that. So I don't know that I have a specific goal, but just try to adapt to the situation and stuff like that. Well, there's a commonality amongst business. Obviously healthcare is very different than manufacturing.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat from
Sure.
Lynn. How have you seen your role of CFO and COO change over time? She also comments that today's CFO seems to be even more strategic and tech savvy and involved in operations. In what ways can the roles work together more effectively? That's a CFO and a COO.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think a lot of it's organizationally dependent. When I joined Swagelok, first of all, Swagelok, they were very, wonderful, welcoming community. So people were very free with their time and teaching. So if you're going to learn, you need somebody to teach or show. So that was very good. Companies tend to have different orientations, and I think what I was most interested in, what Swagelok most needed at the time was a CFO that was really operationally focused and not, we were a private company, so public reporting, for those of you that know it, or, general accepted accounting principles, well, we followed them, it wasn't what, we woke up every day worried about. We were in a public entity. So it was very much the CFO role. It was, and I shaped it more so to be very operationally focused and interactive. So I do think in a lot of organizations, the CFO and the COO can be joined at the hip to improve performance and drive behaviors. Now, some companies, depending on how they're structured, maybe a very large company, the CFO has a more traditional kind of finance-only role. I think, again, it's very situational. As far as technology, yeah, I think, it's become such a big part of our lives. I think every company has to, all the executives have to get pretty savvy in how they can make technology, improve the company, improve their lives. A lot of the early machine learning and stuff like that that's going on in the world is actually happening in the finance area, with robotic processing and stuff like that, because there's high amount of transactions. So today's CFO has to be pretty tech savvy, because it really affects not only the organization but the efficiency of their particular department. So most good-sized companies are really experimenting with a lot of automation, a lot of automated processing, a lot of new technology to kind of make their functions more efficient.
Thank you for that. We have a question from Igor Tudelman, and he would like to read it out as well.
Hi there. My name is Igor, and my question is, you managed Swagelok for so many years. What would you say is your biggest takeaway from that whole experience?
Well, great company, great people. Hopefully, I had a hand in making it even more successful than I came. I think it's the way I go through life, if you will. If you can make something a little bit better than where you found it, and kind of keep adding on to the house, if you use that analogy. We all kind of usually start with some foundation, unless you're just an entrepreneur and start something from grassroots, and then you just keep building on that. So I think that's many a proud moment, many things you would do again. But I think it's that foundation to kind of keep building and building, which is probably the thing you take away the most.
Thank you.
I have a question. What would you say is the most satisfying achievement in your working career?
Yeah, there were certainly many. Our organization, I think many on this call were, probably, pretty young when we went through the 2008, 2009 recession, and then I'm involved in, probably about 15 or 16 companies. I'm not, the CEO of anything during COVID. So, and I think the book on COVID is still being written. So if you go back to the Great Recession, I think our organization came through that with Swagelok came through that with flying colors, because we kept true to our values, and we didn't have any layoffs. We didn't have any knee-jerk things. We talk about managing for the long term, which is kind of rudimentary in my economics background. It's easy to say that, but when you can actually show the organization how you can walk the walk and talk the talk and actually do that, that was really a great time. So I think during that 2008, 2009 timeframe, we came through that time period. Not only did we get through it, but we came through it stronger. Is certainly something I reflect on a lot.
Thank you. We have a question from Dave Krabbe. When COVID is behind us, what behaviors and practices that we are demonstrating now will stay with us to improve business and manufacturing?
Yeah, hi Dave, how are you? I guess I can. There's a pretty interesting McKinsey article that talks about it talks about the effects of COVID, and I'm sure there's many think tanks and high-level consultants that have written about this, but it really stuck with me because it talks about business on two axes, and it talks about demand destruction and business model destruction. So I think every business now that I'm involved in, which is about, I don't know, say 15 or 16, I try to help them think through in some way, maybe differently, but about those two axes, about, and what people mean about, what I mean by that, what the article meant was, you're going to have permanent demand destruction. In other words, whatever product you had, is that not coming back or not coming back for a long time? And business model destruction, is the way the business model works, significantly changed. And, what does that look like? Kind of an example many people think about is restaurants, right? Restaurants, certainly as demand destruction now will come back to pre-COVID levels in general. I guess it probably will, maybe, X amount of years from now. So I think businesses really have to think about that, and then think about, if pandemics, which, there's a great, if anybody hasn't seen it, Bill Gates TED Talk on this, which is actually 5 years old, where Bill Gates actually predicts exactly mostly what's going on. But it actually was a risk that was not unpredictable. It wasn't like, the skies, opened up and God threw a lightning bolt on us. It was predictable, but none of us were prepared. So if we have to prepare for it to happen again, whether it be COVID-19 or some other similar virus or disease, how does that affect our ongoing business? How does that affect our business of, culture? How does it affect our business of being together? How does it affect the way we get work done if we have to go into these periods of hibernation? So I think businesses just need to think through that and see how that changes. I think in manufacturing, certainly a lot more people are thinking more seriously about automation and robotics. Robotics has really gotten to the point where it's not, we talked about machine learning and, kind of intangible robotics, but even the tangible robotics have gotten a lot simpler and easier to use, with cobots or whatever they might be. So I think automation is certainly coming into press a lot more. Connection. Somebody at another university, a little south of you, the president of the University of Akron, he had an interesting comment. We were talking one day and he said, it took education, 20 years to get 20% of their courses online. It took them 20 weeks to get the other 80%. So we'll just look at the business of education and how that's changed. So I do think there's some permanency out there. I think from every business has to try to figure out what that permanency looks like and how it affects their business.
Thanks, Art. Good to see you.
Yes, it did.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Art. We have a question from Robert Lucchese, and he'd like to read it out as well.
Yeah, so I am a prospective hopeful candidate for the Positive Organizational Development Program at Weatherhead. And so when you mentioned working with Richard Boyatzis, a light went off. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more in depth about how you, how you came to the decision to implement emotional intelligence, what impact you noticed it had, what challenges, and what is that looking like during COVID as, things are changing? How is emotional intelligence sort of being woven in?
Yeah, so when I guess a little bit of the way I was built or whatever, cultural background, pretty big on, just development and coaching. When I first joined, when I first started business, before probably everybody, most people on this call were even alive, but certainly most people were working, it was fairly, most companies were fairly, kind of, what today we would call old fashioned, kind of top down, do as I say. And if you keep your head down and do a good job, you get rewarded. And even Ernst & Young didn't have a great, competency-based program or a great feedback system. So I was always interested. And then when I joined Swagelok, I just realized we had so many talented people and so many bright people, but we really had no competency framework to talk about things that were important, again, about how you get your job done, not what. So we worked with a consulting for years. A consulting psychologist, Dave Watterson Associates, out in Chagrin Falls, and they would do 360 feedback and some tools, but we didn't have a robust toolbox. And we were talking early on in my leadership, and I said, it's just, I just would like to develop something that we can talk about, the importance of, back in the day, you might have called them soft skills, about, leadership and collaboration and coaching and strategic thinking and some of these things. And we got on to, the book was by Daniel Goldman or Goldberg about the first emotional intelligence competency book. And then so we got onto that, and we developed our own competency program. And then, like all good things, and when you have good people and time, you can make things really well. You could do things really well. And so we had both those two advantages. And so that program morphed over the years. We worked with Richard a while, and then it kind of morphed to where we, got to a point where we had a competency-based framework where different people, different levels would, there'd be some overlapping competencies, but obviously strategic thinking, for example, was a lot more important as somebody was getting up to be a director and a senior manager and a vice president than it was when you were starting out in your career. So we just kept looking at that and morphing it. And then, all the organizational development firms, the HR firms like Korn Ferry, et cetera, they all have a framework. And so just before I left, we adopted that framework. We kind of morphed ours into theirs, because then it was cloud-based, and it was a place for people to go, and they could develop it and then put the training in place, put the references in place and stuff like that. But I would say it went through constant iteration, but maybe 3 or 4 major rewrites during my 20 years there.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks, Art. A question that I had was sort of relating to the current situation of COVID-19. So given your experience with the 2008 recession through Swagelok and currently through the various companies that you're involved with, how would you compare and contrast them? How would you say they're similar, and how would you say they're dissimilar in terms of the economic impact that's forthcoming?
Well, I think, they're, to your point, Bob, they're both similar and dissimilar. I think in that time frame, there was certainly there were people worried about their jobs and how we were going to get through this, but there weren't people, in general, worried about their lives and their health. So I think this is, quite, so maybe that's where the similarity ends. And now, people are worried about, a lot more things than, just their jobs, about their health, about their children's health, their parents' health, their friends' health, relatives' health. So I think it's added. And then, I believe that, people are social animals, and that people like to congregate with people. And I think it's hard. I also do, even though there's a lot of good stuff written about working remotely and all that, I think the Wall Street this week had an article about some of the maybe disadvantages of it. I do worry about long-term about how companies really prepared to build on their culture with everybody working remotely. So from a business perspective, I think that's the kind of the next frontier. But I think it's different in that people are, there's the health concerns. It makes it very, very, very real and much more, much wider. In the other one, you read about it, but if you were at a professional services firm, they didn't really, probably most professional service firms, not much changed. Now they're all working from home. They all have people they know that had COVID. They all are worried about their own health. So everybody's in this one. It's way broader, and of course the whole world is in various stages of it.
Yeah, thank you. In terms of COVID in general, do you see a potential short-term solution and long-term solution, or do you just see this as more of a long-term wait out the vaccine, or is there something else that you have in mind?
Well, yeah. So it's I don't know. All the pundits say whatever they say because they figure if everybody says something, somebody has to be right. I personally believe until we have a vaccine, until we prove that vaccine is effective, until we prove we can manufacture it, administer it, it's going to be hard to think of business as totally normal. Life is totally normal. So I do think, until we could get that going, we're in for this for a while. And I know a lot of companies are working, real hard on that. It's supposedly some very positive developments, but if you take the science piece and put that aside for a second, which is, as no small task, You got manufacturing, distribution, and then you got, administration. You can't get the vaccine digitally. You can't get it virtually. So people are going to have to go somewhere and get, one, maybe two, maybe three shots. So the supply chain effects of that, just if you think about what your business hat on, I think are really huge. So even if they have a vaccine, unfortunately, it's going to take a while till everybody gets administered. And then there's going to have to be some rationing. I don't think they're going to come out with 7 billion doses ready to go. So I think we're in this until that happens.
Yeah, thank you for that. We have a question from Michael Goldberg.
Thanks, Parv. One of the few privileges I have, I can have a former student call on me, which is nice. I enjoy that. Art, I want to talk to you about kind of your current, sort of flipping to your current world now, where a number of startups and others in the community are coming to you for advice or as an angel investor. And, I'm sort of curious your perspective on, as we look at Northeast Ohio and the ecosystem here and trying to encourage the growth of startups, and when people come to you, any sort of advice? I mean, a number of folks that join our calls often are entrepreneurs or thinking about starting anything. Any perspective or advice for entrepreneurs that may approach an angel investor like someone like yourself? I mean, what are sort of the, I guess, do's and don'ts of as entrepreneurs make the rounds to angel investors and pitch them on ideas? Any advice you might have for them?
Yeah, that's a good question. As Michael, you'll know this statistic better than I do, but I would think most brand new startups, entrepreneurs that go out for a first round of family and friends and angel investing get most of that funds close to home because, those are the sources they know. I would just, say you really need to be able to articulate the business plan and the business value. I think, a lot of good plans, people spend so much time on trying to figure out the market potential that sometimes you miss the forest for the trees, as opposed to just figuring out how that particular idea or product or whatever it is going to be saleable and provide value. So you often talk about a huge market, throw out big numbers, and I think it either scares people or their eyes glaze over. So I think if you just kind of look at the fact that you have a saleable, something that's, what is it saleable? Is it going to be licensed? And don't spend quite as much effort trying to say, it's going to be worth, $1 billion and stuff like that. I think that would be very helpful, because I think a lot of people that haven't done a lot of startups or, work with entrepreneurs, it's easier to poke holes in things than create something out of whole cloth. But it's often hard for that person to see where the value is. If you're buying a company that's, established, you can argue about price, but you can see where the market is they go. You might argue about potential, but when you have a new idea, you really have to make it tangible to the investor about, how is that gonna work? How is that gonna be sellable?
Great, thank you.
All right, thank you, Michael. Thank you, Art. I have a question from Jamila. What are some beneficial changes prompted by 2020? Any aspect of it that Swagelok plans to continue long-term? I'm not sure how much you can talk about this, given your lack of involvement recently, but feel free to answer however you feel.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Paul, can you just repeat the question one time?
What are some beneficial changes prompted by 2020? Any aspect of it that Swagelok plans to continue long-term?
Oh, yeah. So I'm probably not the best guy to ask that, since, there's other people on the phone here that work there. I would just go back to, if I just twist the question a little bit and just say other companies I've been involved in, I just think people are trying to figure that out and figure out, what the effects of that would be. Do they need smaller stores, or do they need different ways of delivering things? Or, is the delivery model different? Is the distribution model different? How do things work differently? On the shop floor, do we have to do things differently, spread out more, whatever it might be? So I think most people are still trying to work through that. I think connectivity is important. I think most people in the U.S. have done okay with that. Some people either in places that have less developed infrastructures have struggled. I think the inner cities, the urban areas and the schools have certainly suffered as a result of that. There's an initiative in Cleveland to bridge the digital divide, as it's called, which is very important. So I do think people are going to really make sure their IT telephony infrastructure is both secure as well as up to speed and stuff like that. But other than that, I think each business is trying to figure out, okay, what's the long-term effects of that? There were other structural shifts that were going on that kind of got exacerbated by this, or maybe accelerated. Like talked about digital learning. Certainly people have figured out how to drive less. So there's the whole thing going around the combustion engine and electric vehicles, and it's not going to accelerate. When is air travel coming back? So there are some big trends out there. People have to decide for themselves if what's the timing of that, how much is permanent, how much of it is timing, and and what they're going to do about it.
Thank you. We have a question from Suniva, and they would like to read it out as well.
Hi, Art. Hello,
Hi,
everyone. Suniva Collins. I'm a former Swagelok associate, and our time overlapped quite a lot at Swagelok, and it was always wonderful to work with you. And I wanted to basically, first of all, talk a little bit about my first memories of working with you at Swagelok and how it was an indication of your commitment to executive leadership. And you don't talk about this very much, but when you first came on, you were actually responsible for the entire engineering function. And I remember you were an early adopter when it came to basically trying to find ways of learning. And so you were taking a class, I think, on chemistry to try and understand that a little bit better, and would come up and have us check your homework. So, so to me, that was a real indication that you were, truly committed to understanding, the product and continuing to learn and then use the methods available. The other thing that I want to highlight that I think you kind of talked about a little bit with organizational behavior and leadership was this commitment to letting basically letting the leadership in the company expecting that they would serve on boards, and this idea of serving on not-for-profit boards around town as a way of connecting with the rest of the community. And I was thinking it would be probably good if you commented a little bit on that.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Yeah, Steve remembers that dark period when I actually had to run engineering for a while. Funny story about that, but I met with the three people that were reporting to me, and they said, "How could you run engineering? You're not an engineer." And I said, "But you all are." So anyway, close to leadership. But I did. I think I did take some engineering classes. Thank God I found somebody to replace me, but as I got to statics and dynamics, because I think that would have done me in. But it was fun. So no, we all had we at Swagelok, I asked all the managers and directors, which is, we were a pretty flat organization back in the day, to serve on nonprofit boards if they could, for two reasons. One, I think it's very important to give back to the community and get involved. But secondly, as you know, on nonprofit boards, going back to my leadership style, and the very first question Parv asked, you have to get things through collaboration mostly. There's not hierarchical power. People will just walk with their, vote with their feet and walk. They don't have to stay involved. So I thought it was great learning for our people. And yes, to Suniva's point, just about everybody was involved in different nonprofits over the years, and it was a great way to give back and learn and develop, good relationships and friendships.
Awesome. Thank you, Suniva. I have a question from Jill Arena.
Hi, thanks so much. Art, has growth through acquisition always been part of your strategy at any company you've run, as well as organic growth? So have you always tried to pair the two together? And if so, what do you look for in the companies you're acquiring?
Yeah, that's a very good question, very astute question. No, I would say at Swagelok, actually most of our growth was organic. because, I think you have to just step back, and our business model, Swagelok's business model was went to market through independent, but yet exclusive distributors. We were, tied at the hip, and they only pretty much sold the Swagelok products, and we pretty much only sold through them. So you had to find a business where it would make sense to acquire that didn't have either their own distribution, or their own distribution would kind of fall apart. So that led us to more of an organic model at Swagelok. Other businesses have different things. So you have to understand, even though it's a part of many companies' strategy, why you're doing it. Is it new markets? Is it new geographies? Is it new products and stuff like that? So I think at the board level, whether it's an advisory board or a fiduciary board, if somebody brings an acquisition, you should be able to forget about its price for a second. You should be able to say, I understand that vis-a-vis the corporate strategy, So I think it really starts with strategy. And if your strategy is such that this is the way you want to grow because of this is that, then acquisitions should feel very natural. If your strategy is, we're just going to be opportunistic and buy things, I would say you don't really have a very good strategy. So I really think it depends on, what your strategy is, where you want to grow, how you want to grow, and a reason to do the acquisitions.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jill. Thanks, Art. We have a question from Lynn Shoda, if they would like to read it out.
Yeah, good afternoon, Art and everybody. My question, Art, centers on when you're interacting maybe with a young entrepreneur, maybe an acquisition, and there's some challenges, and it might be a capacity issue versus a profitability issue. What questions are you really focused on to help them through, particularly the situation right now? And have those questions in retrospective, looking back, previously at your experience, have the questions changed just because of the pandemic?
And Lynn, when you say in other words, the entrepreneur is making the acquisition?
Well, you're working with an entrepreneur, and maybe an entrepreneur comes to you in this situation, and they're saying, I think I've got a bit of a capacity challenge here, profitability, looking at the P&L. What metrics or what type of insight are you trying to glean out of the entrepreneur and what that person is seeing in their business to kind of help them understand even more which really has to take priority, capacity or profitability?
Oh, well, yeah, I think I do know my way around the P&L, with my background and have been there so long. So you do tend to look at the financials and try to understand, how profitable somebody is. But, you can go through the numbers and, try to understand that. But then you try to understand, okay, well, why is it like it is, And then if you try to dissect that, you can look at, are they selling in a commodity space where their costs are high, which is of course not a good place to be in? Do they have moderate costs, but there's, they have a really niche market and they can charge what they, charge a good premium. So you just try to understand why things are the way they are, and then, help them through that. I think a lot of people don't really, really look hard enough at capacity and what they can do, and how much more, you can get at things, whether it be, whether it be by, throughput projects or shifting projects, shifting labor around or different things. So, I often don't find too many companies where they're just out of capacity, as much as, maybe using it better. And then that gets into, do companies have the right metrics? And I think, you could live with a lot of different metrics, but you can't live without any metrics. So if companies aren't measuring the things that are most important to them, they can get themselves upside down pretty quickly. So I always, try to look at a company and see, what are they measuring? And does it, are they doing anything what they're measuring? And does it matter? Does it really matter? So that's kind of, maybe a little bit how approach it, stuff like that. But I would say most people have, most people are, at least on the manufacturing front, usually capacity isn't too big. They have more capacity, they have more headroom.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you.
Thanks, thanks, Art. The next question would be, reflecting on your career, what career mistake has given you the biggest lesson?
Well, certainly, there's an often overused African proverb about it, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Probably not spending as much time as bringing everybody along on some different things would be one. I think the change management, there's a difference. While they're related, there's a difference when you're trying to make big transformative changes. There's a difference between communications and change management. Communications, is a piece of change management, but it's not the only piece. And oftentimes, it's easy to get that confused. You think if you explain why you're making the change, people just go along. So I think spending more time with middle management, supervisors, and stuff like that. In a big organization, a larger organization, it's really important in any organization, but the larger your organization gets, it's really important what their frontline supervisor talks to them about. It's great they see the CEO once every whatever, maybe now more so with video and digital and all that, but they're really going to get their day-to-day stuff from their frontline supervisors. And I think one lesson I learned is make sure that the supervisors and managers really understand what you're trying to do, because that's who, the rank and file folks, that's where they get most of their care and nurturing and day-to-day, accountability from.
Thank you. We have two more questions. The first one is, what would you say is the biggest risk that you've taken in terms of your career over the years, whether that's in your career or professionally while representing a company?
Well, I certainly think, a couple, I joke, when I joined Swagelok, I was, partner with Ernst & Young, had a nice career path and, just kind of said, always wanted to try to do something on my own, going to change. So I would think that was a pretty big risk at the time. And then, I'd say, one of the better things that happened to me is as a real young man, I came to Cleveland from, New York City. And, I had gone to undergraduate to City College in New York, CCNY, and, commuted and for a variety of family reasons and, a chance to just do something at a very young age and come out to Ernst & Young's national office was, a nice opportunity and a career change. So I think those were the biggest risks. But I go back to what I said. I said, if you're not gonna bet on yourself and take risks, then why would you expect somebody else to take a risk and bet on you and stuff like that? So I always, say go long on yourself first.
Awesome, thank you. And our final question for today would be, what advice did you have for the CEO that was incoming after you decided that you would like to retire?
Well, what we would do, we had a very, and by the way, anything I did at Swagelok, it's the big we. I didn't do anything alone. Had great staff, great people, great, help and mentorship. That you don't really do very much alone, and make things work. We had a very robust onboarding program that was developed, and I actually think Jim was even a piece of it. And one of the things we asked, I would always tell people to make changes from the inside out. And what I meant by that is, I think there was a lot of changes in my 20 plus years, 23 years, whatever it was, and a lot more to still to come. But I always try to do it with an eye on why things were the way they were, and an eye on our past and our history and our legacy. So once you understand why something is being done, I think it's great to suggest a different way or a better way to change it. But, so on one side, I love looking at different business models and saying, how could I apply that? Matter of fact, I don't know, it's kind of like a parlor game for me. I'll see something in one industry and I'll try to say, how would it apply in another industry? On the flip side, just saying company X does this without knowing anything about your, the current organization and why they do things the way they are isn't very helpful. So I would always try to counsel people when they join the organization from the outside. Is we're all about change. People are all about change. Change is good, but you have to understand why we do things. And I would always say make changes from the inside out. In other words, make changes with an understanding of why things are the way they are, and then you could certainly suggest to change them. But just to say, at company A, we did it this way, we're going to do it this way without understanding the full picture can be disruptive on one hand and dangerous at the other.
Great, thank you for that. It seems like we have time for one more question, so I think I will steal this question from
Michael promised me overtime after 2 o'clock.
That's great. So the final question that I have for myself would be, as somebody who's a part of the class of COVID-19, just starting out my career, post everything that's happening, what's the one piece of advice that you would give to me or somebody else in my position?
Well, I guess you have to, maybe get a little philosophical or theological here. You have to believe in a greater order, and you have to believe in mankind. So you have to believe we're going to get to the other side of this thing, because if you believe this was life as normal, I don't know what that would mean. So you have to believe that. So I would say during the COVID, so many businesses are apprenticeships, right? They're about going back to the learning that, yes, there are more digital tools, and I don't want to sound old-fashioned, but business by and large is set up on an apprenticeship basis. I mean, nobody uses that term, but that's what it is. So, if you're on a Zoom call and you don't understand something, are you going to pick up the phone and try to call somebody and say, do you have 5 minutes? I really don't understand that. Now, if you're in the room with them, it's really easy as you're breaking or going to get a cup of coffee or Coke or whatever to walk with them and say, could you explain that? But I think it's a lot harder in this environment. So don't give that up. Don't give that up. If you need to learn something, if you don't understand something, it might take more time. It might be more inefficient, but don't give that up, because then there'll be huge holes. And when we do get back to normal, you don't want to be disadvantaged. So I'd say that's one thing, is continue to figure out how to build your apprenticeship while you're doing it digitally, which, maybe is easier said than done, and maybe somebody will have a great idea for a learning technology I haven't thought of yet. I think that would be one thing. And then I just think you have to figure out how to still be have some social interaction, whether, it's digital or 6 feet apart with masks on or something. But, I just think it's important to stay connected, to be connected and, embrace the world as it is. And, firmly believe we're going to get to the other side of this.
Yeah, that's great advice. Thank you so much. Before I hand it over to Doug, before he closes us off, do you have any closing remarks that you'd like to make?
No, thanks for setting this up. It was fun to do. I was, before we shut down, maybe it was a sign from higher above, I was going to be the commencement speaker at the Weatherhead Graduate Program school. So I think it's a sign, going back to my comment, I have a face for radio. So maybe that's what will happen. But it was great to do this. And, there's plenty of stuff online where people can learn and tune into conferences and do similar things. I just encourage you to make sure you take advantage of them.